Let me know if this sounds familiar. You've put in a lot of hard work and time and energy into perfecting the perfect recipe to make the perfect candle time after time after time. But then you go and you make a batch of candles, you test one of those candles, and for some reason, the wicking is way off. Too small, too big, a tunnel, the flame's too large. What's going on? I mean, you tested this candle, this wick, this jar fragrance combination over and over. You documented your results. You know it works. But for some reason, this particular batch of candles is failing you. I know we've all been there. I know we've all experienced this. Why does this happen? And what can we do about it? That is the topic of today's video. Hello everyone, my name is Wade Thomas. I am the owner of Black Tie Barn Candle Company, and it has been a minute. Yes, I have been out of commission for a few weeks now. As many of you know from my previous videos, I mentioned that I would be moving and relocating, and I'm actually still in the process of that. I am nowhere near being settled, but at least I'm in a place where I can do a few videos again, particularly the type like this where it's a discussion type of video, more of an informative one rather than a demonstration one. Now, I will get back to those as soon as I can, but it's going to be a bit before I can get the workshop fully ready and functional again. So it's taking longer than expected, but as we all know, moving can be a pain. So I appreciate all of your patience. I'm glad you stuck around. And I also want to mention and give a big thanks to everyone, because just in the couple weeks that I've been kind of out of commission and kind of ghosted everyone in a sense, we went from 500 subscribers to over 1,100 now, like just in a few weeks. So that is awesome. And that's just all thanks to you, because even while I wasn't posting new videos, we were still having more engagement, and everyone was kind of jumping on board and starting to see the current videos that were already there. So I really appreciate all of you for sticking with me and kind of being patient through this process as I relocate. All that out of the way, let's get back to the topic of today's video. So I gave an example in the introduction of this video of making this perfect recipe only to see it fail us randomly sometime down the road. We've all been there, or at least most of us have. It happens. What can we do about it? And why does it happen? Well, let's start with the why. The reason this happens is because there are variations in waxes from lot to lot and batch to batch. Now, this is just manufacturing variations. No wax is made exactly the same as another. Even though it's the same type of wax and it's the same manufacturer, there's still variations. And there's actually an acceptable level of variation that these waxes have to meet before they can go out the door, or at least most of them have a acceptable level of variation. However, an acceptable level of variation can be still enough to alter the performance of your wax and how you need to wick that wax. You may have tested several of your recipes with a particular lot of wax, and that particular lot of wax might have a different congealing point, for example, than the next lot of wax by that same manufacturer. And overall, most of these lots of waxes are fairly consistent and pretty reliable. However, there are times when they are substantially off, and that is when you have major issues where the proper wick is nowhere near the one that you have documented. For example, you have a candle with a particular fragrance that you know always takes an HTP 93 wick, but for some reason in this exact same recipe a month later, but with a new lot of wax, it now requires the 93's tunneling. Maybe now it requires a 104 or 105, or the 93 is much too large and now it requires like a 73 or an 83. This is typically because something changed with the wax in the manufacturing of that particular lot. So there's a few things that you can do when you're purchasing new lots of waxes. And I will generally do this myself, at least with some of the manufacturers that I work with a lot. The first thing is I will always ask for the details on a particular lot of wax. Now they kind of have their own formula or measurement or rating that they give each one of these waxes. Again, at least some of them do. And they can tell you on that scale where the variation has changed. Has it changed by 1 point or 2 points, or maybe it changed by 5 points on their scale? Well, small variations aren't really going to change anything, but if there is a significant enough variation, it can really alter how you wick that particular wax. So that's the first thing you can do, is always check with your manufacturer or your supplier about the variations in this lot versus other lots. That can be kind of difficult to do, and sometimes they might not have the best answer for you. So my favorite idea is what is called baselining your wax. And that is actually the purpose of today's video. So what exactly does it mean to baseline your wax? Well, baselining is essentially the process of taking your naked wax, or the wax in its native form, without adding anything to it. No oils, no additives, no color, nothing. Put that in the jar that you use the most, or several jars if you'd like. And then you're going to wick that jar with several different wicks and sizes. And then you're ultimately going to choose kind of the wick that you like the best in that naked wax. And then you're going to document the results. And you're going to use that reference point for all future lots of waxes. So anytime you buy a new case or a new lot of wax and it's a different lot number than the original one that you baselined, you're going to perform a simple test with the exact same wick that you documented before, and then you're going to see how it compares. Is it consistent to the results you got before? If good, you're ready to go. All your recipes should work fine. If not, then there's probably a significant variation in that wax, that lot of wax, and you might need to alter your wicking. You might need to go up a size, down a size, and you might have to experiment a little bit before you go wasting a lot of money adding oils and creating a bunch of candles that might not perform correctly. So that's a kind of a summary of what baselining is. But we need to talk about what baselining is versus what it is not. So one purpose of baselining is create a reference point to test future lots of wax against. In other words, how do you know that you have a good or bad lot of wax? And I shouldn't say good or bad. What I should say is, how do you know you have a consistent or inconsistent lot of wax if you don't baseline it? The other purpose of what baselining is to give you more insight into your wax, so you know a little bit more about how your wax works in its native and naked state. This can help you troubleshoot future issues, but also just let you understand better how your wax behaves on its own. Let's mention what baselining is not. The purpose of baselining is not to help you find the right wick for your wax. Now, I know that sounds like I'm contradicting myself, but hear me out. The purpose of baselining is find a wick to use as a reference point. Like, this wick burns this way in this wax, and any change in the wax should be reflected in future testing with that wick. But it's not meant to identify the correct wick for your wax for every candle in the future, because other variables affect wicking. The fragrance oil that you're using, how much fragrance oil you're using, the jar you're using, whether or not you're using color, or any other additives for that matter. All of those are factors that affect the recipe. And so all of those are going to affect wicking. You can't find or rely on a single wick for your wax. There is no one-size-fits-all wick. Now, I have another video I'll link up above and also in the description below that talks all about wicks and wicking theory and what you should be looking for with wicking, and all these different factors can affect wicking. So again, the purpose of baselining is not to help you identify the perfect wick for your wax. That's just not possible to do until you've added the other variables in. It's purely meant to be a reference point for future testing. So now that we understand why you should baseline, what it is and what it is not, let's talk about how to do it. Number one, choose your wax. Obviously. If you use several different waxes, then you're going to need to do several different baselines. Most people, especially starting out, only use one or two waxes. You're going to want to baseline those because every purchase of a new lot of wax, you'll want to test for consistency. Number two, choose your jar. Now again, you might have several different jars, and if so, I would probably baseline each of them, because the larger your jar becomes, the more variation you're going to get in wicking. And so it might be harder to see differences and variations in the wax and wicking in smaller diameter jars, but you'll notice them more as the jar enlarges. So I personally baseline all my wax in each of my jars that I use, but at the very least, at least baseline in kind of a average size jar, particularly one that you use most, if not all of the time. Number three, choose a variety of wick types. If you are already pretty familiar with your wax, you might already know which wick types that you find to work the best with your wax, and that's great. And so you can kind of probably single out a few different wick types and just run with those. If you're new to your wax and you're new to candle making in general, I would buy sample packs of several different wick types. Number four, choose different wick sizes of each wick type. Choosing wick types is really important, but you also are going to have to test several wick sizes of each one of those types. So if you choose, 4 wick types, you're probably going to want to choose 4 or 5 different sizes of each one. So you might have 20 testers to baseline. Now, again, this might sound daunting and overwhelming, but you're only really going to do this once. And it's really to determine that reference point, that baseline going forward. And then in the future, as you test these new lots of wax come in, you're really only going to test one. And then as long as it compares pretty consistently, you're done. So in this part of the process, you're really going to want to test several different wick types as well as several different wick sizes of each one of those types. Step number 5, it's time to wick all those jars with all your variations of wicks. Make sure that you're documenting and tracking which wick and what size is in each jar. Using some kind of notepad, whatever tracking system you want. I'm actually going to do a video on this in the future as well. You could, for now, just put a piece of masking tape on each jar and write down the wick type and size on each one of those jars. And then you're going to test them. That's all part of step 5 here. Wick them and start testing them. Now, during this, you need to make sure you're testing each one the same across the board. That way you can ensure accurate results between each of those jars. You're going to want to document each one at 1 hour mark, 2 hour mark, 3 hour mark, and a 4 hour mark. And do this however you want. Take pictures, take notes, whatever you want to do. Just make sure you're kind of documenting the process. And if you see that some of these are not even going to make it through the first hour, they're already failing by hour 2, go ahead and blow them out and get them out of the mix. If you can see early on that they're complete failures, you don't have to spend any more time on those. But make sure that you're at least all the ones that you plan to continue testing, you're treating those the same and fairly across the board. And remember, during baselining, you're only testing the wax itself. No oils, no dyes, no UV, no other additives, nothing at all, only the wax and the wick. Now, I just touched on this in the previous step, but this next step, you're going to make sure you're documenting all these results. And then not just at the 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, and 4 hour mark, but also the overall results during each one of these marks, including at the overall 4 hour mark. You're going to want to document specific details: the width of the melt pool, the depth of the melt pool, is there any hang up on the jar, things like that. And again, take very specific detailed notes on this part of the process, because these are what you're going to help you build your baseline going forward. Oh, and the next step, which honestly you probably should move up to step number 1 along with choosing your wax, is make sure you document the specific lot number of that wax. If it doesn't show it on the box that you ordered or the case that you ordered, make sure you reach out to your supplier. They should have that information for you. Without that, this becomes completely useless. So, all right. So after these set of steps, you now have your baseline. All right. You've chosen what wick and this jar with this wax, with that lot number of wax, this is how it should perform. Keep this handy, keep it safe, because this is now your reference point for every new lot of wax. So where do you go from here? The last step is to test against your baseline, test against your reference point. So whenever you visit your supplier's website and you put in another order for wax, you get that wax to your place and you start to make your candles. Before you rush into making batches of candles, by the way, if it's the same lot number as the one you baseline, then you really don't need to do that, but chances are it will not be. So grab some wax, put it in your jar, put the same wick that you chose during your baselining, and do a test. At the very least, do the 4 hour test, but I would recommend doing probably 2 to 3 burns for accuracy. And then just compare the results versus your baseline. Did it look pretty much the same after 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours? Are you getting fairly consistent results with your melt pool? Things like that. If the results are consistent, then you should consider this a reliable lot of wax, and all your recipes and all that hard work you've done should work with this lot of wax. And you shouldn't have any major concerns with its performance. However, if the results vary, you find out that your wick that you chose before in your baseline just isn't quite good enough for this wax. Maybe it's tunneling, it's too small, it's having a hard time reaching the edges, or maybe it seems way too large on this new lot of wax. Use your observations, compare them to the previous results of your baseline, and then adjust accordingly. If you see that the wick is tunneling, well, this particular lot of wax probably has a higher congealing point or a slightly higher melting point, or it's potentially more dense. Whatever the reason may be, it seems to need a larger or hotter burning wick. So try wicking up. Or if the wick appears to be too large for this particular lot of wax, then maybe it's a softer or a lower congealing point or less dense. In that case, you can wick down. Test again, see if you can get comparable results to the baselining before, and if so, now you know how to adjust for your candles going forward. All right, so you're done, finally. Now I know this sounds like a lot of work, but it's really truly worth it. Baselining is a lot of work, but fortunately most of that work is all up front, and it also teaches you to understand your wax a lot better than you probably would have before. Plus, now that you have this baseline, this reference point, testing becomes easier in the future. Not to mention, you're going to start feeling a lot more confident about your candles batch to batch if you can trust your wax. What's kind of ironic about wax is that most people kind of assume and believe that the wax is the most simple and consistent part of their candles. Everyone worries about their fragrance oils and wicking, which totally understand, right? Those are the variables that tend to change from candle to candle. But those variables are intentionally changing candle to candle. You're choosing a different fragrance oil. You're choosing how much fragrance oil to use. You're choosing the wick that goes into your candle. You're choosing the jar. You're not choosing the variance in your wax. And that is why this is a tricky one. So every candle maker might be thinking, well, I know my wax. I use 464, or I use 6006, or I use a coconut wax. Whatever the wax may be, everyone just kind of takes that for granted and thinks that, well, because that's what I use, at least the one thing I don't have to worry about anymore is my wax. I know my wax and I know how it works. Fortunately, as we just kind of discussed and talked about, your wax, even though it's the one thing that might not change overall candle to candle, it has the most variance batch to batch. And this also explains why so many candle makers, particularly newer ones that are starting out, are struggling and don't understand why when they tested a candle and they get perfect results, why they can't continue to get those same results in future batches. And that is because most likely the wax changed on them just enough to affect wicking. So I would encourage you to follow these steps, get a good baselining process. You don't have to use mine. You can use your own process if you'd like. These are just kind of the steps that I use. And I think you'll start seeing more consistent results batch to batch. So real quick, let's summarize a few key other reasons and benefits to baselining your wax. First and foremost, probably the most significant reason is that wax varies from lot to lot. Manufacturers don't intentionally vary their waxes, but it just happens as part of the process. So for that reason alone, baselining your wax can help you recognize these variations and then adjust accordingly. Another reason to baseline is that you start to learn more about your wax and how it behaves natively on its own. You get more insight into your wax and understand. The more you can understand about your own products, your own materials, the better off you'll be. Another good reason is that it's a good, quick way for you to test your lot of wax for consistency without sacrificing fragrance oil and sacrificing money. All you have to do is grab a jar, put that new lot of wax in that jar, add your wick, and test it naked. I mean, not you, the wax. I mean, I guess you could do it naked if you want, but my point is just test the wax with nothing else in it. All right. And finally, a side benefit is that it provides a decent starting point for you when you are going to actually test new candles, meaning you now have a decent idea of a wick that works with this wax, or maybe a couple wicks that work with this wax. And so whenever you're going to start adding fragrance oil and changing your jars around and changing your recipes a bit, or adding new candles to your collection with this wax, you have a pretty good idea of what wick kind of to start with for testing. Now, I would still test several variations or sizes of that wick, or of both wicks if you kind of settled on two. But my point is baselining, because it teaches you more about your wax, you also have a better understanding of how to wick it in the future. And again, that's just another way to save more money and more time. I really hope this video has been helpful and valuable to everyone. Really wanted to illustrate the reasons why you should baseline your wax, how to do it, and why it's important. Thank you all for stopping by. If you enjoyed this video, I encourage you to check out the other videos in my collection, and I will be adding more in the future. So if you're interested in seeing those future videos, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.